now stands. At the time of the Laetrile trials, there were 3 Rockefellers on the board of directors: James, Lawrence, and William. And they were there, of course, to see to it that there was efficiency in their philanthropy. So here's what happened. Segura's findings did not please the board of directors. Why? Because they were not interested in a cure for cancer that cannot be patented. Anything that comes from nature cannot be patented. They're not interested in that. But what they are interested in, finding something perhaps within something in nature, if they can find some subcomponent that they can extract and then make it a man-made chemical that works the same way, then they can patent that, then they're interested, but not if it comes from nature, and it doesn't make any difference whether it works. Now, how do we know this? Congressman John Kelsley used the Freedom of Information Act to obtain a copy of the minutes of the Board of Directors of Sloan Kettering dated July 2nd, 1974. And from the minutes it said, quote, "Sloan Kettering is not enthusiastic about studying amygdalin, but would like to study cyanide-releasing drugs," end quote. Now, if you understand that sentence, you understand everything that I'm talking to you about today. Not interested in amygdalin, because that's in nature. But if we can find a drug, meaning a man-made patentable drug that works the same way, we're interested. Count us in. All right. So, we translate that into the real world of FDA approval. You know, the FDA now requires all of these substances to be used in the treatment of any disease to go through a rigorous testing process. We have all heard that. I've forgotten the number. It goes up every month. I guess it's $20 million or more, maybe much more, for the average drug to get processed and tested, and they test it for efficiency, efficacy, and safety. Well, who is going to spend $20 million testing the safety and efficacy of an apricot seed? You can't patent it. It's just money down the drain. Surely these drug companies aren't going to spend $20 million or more testing any substance from nature because it can't be patented. That, and of course the FDA says it's illegal to use unless it's been tested for efficacy and safety. Now you see the catch-22 you're in there. Nothing from nature, regardless of how effective it might be, will ever be proven safe or effective according to the FDA. It'll never be. Because nobody's going to spend the money to go through the test. So therefore, everything from nature will always be condemned by the FDA as unproven. An unproven cancer cure, which is the label they tried to hang on Laetrile. It was indeed unproven in terms of FDA testing, but it was very well proven in the clinics and in the hospitals and in the laboratories of the people who were using it with a serious intent. So let's go back to Sloan Kettering, see what happened. Dr. Segura was pulled off the project. They said he must have made a mistake. And so they gave it to another group to test. It was Drs. Elizabeth Stockett and Lloyd Schlone. And they came up with essentially the same results as Segura did. In fact, in some ways, they were even more favorable. So they were pulled off the project, too. They must have made a mistake. Now, their reports were never released to the public. We do have them, by the way, but they were buried. At the time, they were not released. The only way we know about them is because they were later leaked by people inside Sloan Kettering who were highly incensed at what was going on. Finally, the tests were given to Dr. Franz Schmidt, and the results confirmed Segura's findings. But these were not released either. Schmidt was told to remain silent. The tests were finally turned over to a Dr. Daniel Martin at the Catholic Medical Center, not even in Sloan Kettering. And he was told, see what you can do with this. And finally, the tests showed that Laetrile had no appreciable effect on the treatment of cancer. Now, I got a little bit ahead of myself because there was a little niche in there. The first trial at the Catholic Center was aborted. You're going to love this. It was aborted because Dr. Segura, who was invited to be an observer, he had nothing to do with the tests, but he was invited to be an observer, said, oh, I know which, it was supposed to be a double-blind test, right? Where nobody knows which mice are receiving the saltwater injections, the saline injections, and which ones are getting the Laetrile. He looked at him, he says, oh, I know which ones. He said, the healthy ones are the ones getting the Laetrile. And it was true. And they said, oh, well, he guessed. Now it's no longer a double-blind study, so they canceled it, and they got Segura out of there. And they went into it for one last time, this time without Segura around. They came up finally with the test they were looking for. Laetrile had no appreciable effect on cancer. Now, this test in itself, I'm giving you more details than perhaps you want, but I think these are very revealing. The test was obviously rigged. It was rigged for failure. And how we know that is that the mice receiving the placebo, or the saline injection, had their tumors stopped growing, it said in the report, 40% of the time. That's impossible. If that were true, then salt water is the cure we're all looking for. How could they do that? And it was so obviously false. Well, they did it because the Laetrile mice were getting recovery at 40%, and they wanted to show that there was no difference between the two groups. So they could honestly say at the end, there's no difference. Laetrile doesn't show any appreciable improvement over the tests, over the controls. And so they had to resort to that weird and absurd statement that saline solution reduced tumor growth in 40% of the mice. And nobody, hardly anybody, ever dug into the report itself to read the details. They just looked at the conclusion, at the front cover of the report, which said Laetrile doesn't work. That's all they wanted to read. All right. Now that is the report that Sloan Kettering finally released to the world. Dr. Lewis Thomas, the president of Sloan Kettering, told the press, quote, there is not a particle of scientific evidence to suggest that Laetrile possesses any anti-cancer properties at all, end quote. See, these people lie. And they're lying on a topic that affects your life and the lives of your family. And they're lying. And we honor them in great dinners. We call them sir. And they're murderers. At this press conference, Dr. Segura was standing in the back of the room. He was told not to say anything. He was just to be there, to look good. And one of the newspaper reporters spotted him and he said, Dr. Segura, your early tests said that Laetrile was very effective. Do you still stick by those conclusions? And Segura said, I stick. That was all he could say. All right, there you have it. I call it genocide in Manhattan. So who are they, John? I've given you a few names, just a few of them. They're all over the place. Now, let me hasten to point out that this does not necessarily mean, in fact, it does not mean at all, that most of these, or even many of these people, are conspirators who are trying to keep a control for cancer away from mankind. It's the profit motive, ladies and gentlemen. It's not that they're trying to kill people, literally. They are killing people, but that's not their motive. Their motive is to make a buck. Their motive is to ignore anything that's competition to making a buck. And in that process of ignoring something from nature, it's causing unimaginable human suffering and death. We know that they're not doing this consciously because they themselves are victims. They